Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering the 5 most underrated spells in Baldur's Gate 3. At this point, I've done a ton of Baldur's Gate 3 build guides, which has meant that I've seen a lot of opinions about how to build good characters. In fact, I would say that outside of the developers who have the actual stats, I'm one of the people in the world with the most information on how people like to build their Baldur's Gate 3 characters. So today I wanted to talk about some mechanics that I see consistently underestimated and underused. And in particular, 5 spells that I get a lot of questions about. People ask me why I take them, how to use them, or say that they never get value out of them when I take them. These are extremely powerful tools, but it might not be clear at first glance how to get the most out of them. So we're going to talk about each of these spells, what makes them so good, and then I'll show a little bit of using them in actual play to hopefully give you a better idea of how to use these incredibly powerful options in your own playthroughs. If you're already using them, of course, then great. I mean, hopefully this will show you some new ways, but you're already ahead of the game. And if you aren't using them, then with luck, this will let you add some more powerful weapons to your toolbox so that you can have smoother and more enjoyable playthroughs. I'm going to talk about these in no particular order, but first up, we have how to stun an entire encounter with no saving throw, otherwise known as Plant Growth. Plant Growth is a level 3 spell with a 60-foot range and a 20-foot radius, meaning it can affect enemies up to 80 feet away. Enemies inside the circle have their movement speed quartered. This is a tremendous debuff that will stop enemies completely from doing anything in a lot of circumstances. 1/4 of their movement speed for a typical enemy with a 30-foot move speed reduces their move speed to 7.5 feet. That means that an enemy who is in the center of the plant growth is forced to use their action to dash in order to leave it. An enemy who has to traverse 10 feet of radius with a 7.5-foot movement speed will have to move twice, so they're going to have to dash out of it. An enemy at the back of the plant growth, or who has to cross the entire thing, is going to have to dash and then also use all of their movement from their subsequent turn, or almost all their movement from their subsequent turn. So a melee enemy who's trapped on the far side of a plant growth is going to need at least 2 turns before they do anything. This is a very similar spell to Spike Growth, the level 2 spell, which has a 20-foot radius, 60-foot range, and does damage, as well as reducing enemy movement speed. But quartering move speed and halving move speed are very different scenarios. An enemy can easily get out of Spike Growth. Not that Spike Growth is a bad spell, it's an amazing spell, but they're much more easily able to leave it. And Spike Growth is also concentration, so there's a lot of circumstances where Plant Growth will just win encounters outright, where Spike Growth wouldn't do that much. There's a couple things that make this spell a little more difficult to use, and this, I think, is why it's so often underrated. Firstly, enemies can jump out of it, and an enemy who jumps out of it will ignore the difficult terrain penalty. And secondly, it can catch on fire. So you need to be very careful with where you position it relative to fires, and you need some way to stop enemies from jumping. Luckily, there's a lot of ways available in the game to do that, including some very powerful spell combos, and many of them don't involve saving throws at all, so you can use Plant Growth to lock down an entire encounter. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So let's imagine that we want to fight a dangerous group of melee enemies. In this case, as an example, we're going to use the Steel Watchers and the Flaming Fists here in Baldur's Gate. We're going to start a brawl, but not run afoul of the law. These enemies are mostly melee, and they're clustered relatively tightly together, although we could move them closer together, using an effect like Minor Illusion to pull them together before we start combat, if we're doing this from stealth. They also have to pass through a choke point in order to get to us. Now, this is a fairly wide choke point, but nonetheless, they have to pass through this area in order to reach us, and so we can win this encounter outright using Plant Growth and other spells that combo with it, thanks to the scenario that we find ourselves in. So let's go ahead and cast Plant Growth. Now our goal is for the most dangerous enemies, in this case the Steel Watchers, to have to pass through at least 2/3 of the Plant Growth in order to get to us. So usually you want to put them in kind of the back half of plant growth, just cast it with the center just a little bit on the side of your party compared to the enemies. We also want to hit as many of these other enemies as possible and make sure that they are also having to move through the plant growth, but the idea is to shut down the dangerous enemies and stun them with no save. So we're going to go ahead and find the perfect pixel where we can do that, which is, I think, right about here, and place a plant growth. Now, these enemies have to struggle to reach us, but they can all jump. Luckily, there are ways to prevent them from doing that. Firstly, of course, in Baldur's Gate, there's a lot of enemies that can't jump at all. Things like oozes and stuff often do not have a jump ability at all. And so those enemies you can just use plant growth on naturally. However, there are also a bunch of spells that combine extremely well with plant growth to fully shut down an encounter. In this case, we're going to use Hunger of Hadar, which has a blind with no saving throw attached to it. It's also conveniently exactly the same size and shape as plant growth, so we can just layer it directly on top. We're going to go ahead and cast Hunger of Hadar, making sure that we get as many of these enemies in the blind effect as possible, and that'll start combat.
Witnessed assaultings.
And while normally this would be a pretty difficult encounter, you're going to see how little these enemies are able to do. Okay, well, the Steel Watcher here sort of cheated and kept moving, but it will still have trouble getting to us. You're going to see how little these enemies are able to do thanks to this incredible spell combo. Here we have our Ranger, of course, who can just fire shots to any of the enemies that we can still see. And because he's a ranger, could also move freely over the plant growth. Another tool that you can use with plant growth is characters that are immune to difficult terrain, like rangers and druids, can pass freely over it, so you can run back and forth across it, causing enemies to have to move towards you over and over. Let's go ahead and pass the turn. We'll make it the Steel Watcher's turn, and we're going to see that they are just going to have to pass their turns completely without doing anything, because as soon as they enter the plant growth, they become unable to act meaningfully. They get slowed so incredibly that they're just going to waste their turn completely passing it. This enemy also cheated just a little bit and snuck outside the edge of the Hunger of Hadar. That's just because we're fighting guards. Against any other enemy that wouldn't have happened. But as long as we maintain concentration on Hunger of Hadar, we will still be able to shut down this entire encounter. Another thing that we can do, of course, because we are using a Warlock in this case, we have Repelling Blast. So enemies that make it to the edge of the Hunger of Hadar, we can push backwards away from ourselves. Or if we have a strength-based character with a strong athletics check, we can push them back to the other side and force them to undergo the whole painful process over and over and over again. So let me pass the turn again, and I'll show you just how devastating this is for the entire group of enemies. So we're going to pass the turn, and this enemy is going to use their turn dashing and just move further into the zone of pain. This enemy is going to back out and use a suboptimal ranged attack by throwing javelins. That's actually somewhat unusual behavior for the AI, but because Flaming Fists prioritize using their javelins, in this case, they're backing out to throw a couple ranged attacks, but obviously you would rather they do that than close to melee. This one is doing the same thing, and then this other Flaming Fist who's in the center is going to spend their turn healing because, of course, they are a healer. So you can see that the enemies did not get to do any of the things that they wanted to do, and the Steel Watchers both effectively passed their turn completely. If we have a shove or another effect that can push them further back into the Hunger, like if Will here had 1 initiative over the Steel Watcher, he could use Repelling Blast to push them back in. We can also, because our Ranger is not concentrating on a spell, we can cast another spell like Fog Cloud in order to blind enemies who move even further out, or something like Spike Growth to extend the damaging and slowing area even further, since Plant Growth is not a concentration spell. Our Cleric could also place a spiritual weapon in the center to distract enemies. It's immune to the effects of the blind from Hunger of Hadar and floats over the plant growth. So there's a lot of tools we can use to distract enemies, and you can see that with no saving throw, we just forced an entire group of enemies to effectively pass their turn. Next up, a level 4 Cleric spell, Guardian of Faith. Not to be confused with Spirit Guardians, which is the level 3 AoE damage spell. That one's not underrated. Guardian of Faith summons an immobile summon that attacks anything that gets close to it. It has 60 hit points, and whenever an enemy gets near it, they have to make a dexterity saving throw, or they take exactly 20 damage. The amount of damage that is dealt by this, the Guardian of Faith itself also takes itself. So it can only usually do 3 of these 20 damage attacks. However, if the enemy makes their saving throw and takes half damage, the Guardian of Faith itself only takes 10 damage, and there's a couple other tricks we can use to prolong its usage. Firstly, just at baseline, if you just think of this as a level 4 spell slot for 60 damage, that's a very good ratio. Compared to other level 4 spell slots, none of them come close to doing an average of 60 damage, and this one always does exactly 60 damage, which is great. And anytime it doesn't do that much, it's absorbed a bunch of enemy attacks, which is also great. It has 60 HP and 20 AC, so if enemies do attack it, they're fairly likely to miss, especially early in the game, so they can often waste their turns. And the really nice thing about Guardian of Faith is that it is big. It's a large-sized creature, meaning that it takes up more space on the battlefield than most other summons, so you can use it to block doorways, even wider doorways that you normally wouldn't be able to block. Let's look at how that looks in actual practice. So we're going to pick on this group of Flaming Fists again. Now, obviously, we could start the fight first, and I'm going to do that just to prevent them from cheating and teleporting like they did last time. And then we'll use the Guardian of Faith in order to block the doorway here. So we're going to have Will go ahead and start a combat.
Assaulting someone.
And just back off around the corner. And then Shadowheart is going to place a Guardian of Faith in order to stop the enemies from getting to us. See the width of this doorway? We're going to put it exactly in the center, and that should close off the space to either side just enough that enemies cannot pass through it easily. So then we're going to move off to the side, and they will have to deal with the Guardian of Faith. Of course, we can continuously attack them with shots through the doorway before they get to us. So let's go ahead and do that a little bit. Just stack up some debuffs and everything on them, and then we're just going to get out of their line of sight so that if they want to fight us, they have to get through the Guardian. Pass a turn, and we've got the Steel Watcher. So the Steel Watcher is going to dash because it doesn't have a good path to get to us, and then just pass the turn. Again, we're just kind of abusing the AI here. In this case, we also blinded it, but because the AI doesn't have a good path to reach us, it's going to behave very unusually and will often just pass the turn. This Steel Watcher is going to jump, it moves into the radius of the Guardian of Faith, and then attacks it. Guardian of Faith is immune to prone, so even though it took a bunch of damage there, it still survives. And then these enemies, again, are going to waste their turn making these ranged attacks against this summon. Now, this does cost the summon a lot of hit points, so obviously we want to make sure that it continues to do stuff for us next round as well. Normally, you can't heal the Guardian of Faith. However, there's a couple ways to get extra value out of it that are extremely helpful. Firstly, Aid will restore its hit points. Aid is both healing and increase to your maximum health, and unlike almost every other healing effect in the game, it works on constructs and undead. So if we use a level 6 Aid spell, we get 30 more hit points, or 25 more hit points, on the Guardian of Faith. Another tool that we could have used is Warding Bond. If it had a few more hit points remaining, we could use Warding Bond, increasing its AC and giving it resistance to all damage. That includes the damage that it does to itself. So when the Guardian of Faith attacks, it will only take 10 damage on a hit or 5 damage on a miss. And so it's going to last for much longer. Again, we can use this to delay enemies while we shoot them through the doorway or put up other effects. We can similarly use effects like Spiritual Weapon to distract them even further. So we could do something like this as well. And that's a bonus action non-concentration spell as well. If the Guardian of Faith, if you don't want enemies to attack the Guardian of Faith and instead just want it to do its own attacks for maximum damage, you can put Sanctuary on it as well, and then they won't be able to attack it until it attacks. That will break the Sanctuary, but that can buy it a turn or two, especially if there's lots of ranged enemies that you're worried about depleting its hit points. So you can use this to fully clog a doorway in a very effective way, and it's extremely efficient when it comes to the amount of damage that you get from the spell slot. So Guardian of Faith, very useful strategic tool. Next up, another 4th level spell, Freedom of Movement. This is actually kind of a funny one, because I think people appropriately rate the effects of the spell as being generally pretty good, but underrate casting the spell. Freedom of movement sort of has two modes. Firstly, it's a day-long non-concentration buff. That's obviously really good, and really good especially in Baldur's Gate, where day-long non-concentration buffs can be cast by an ally who stays at camp, and you get to keep the benefits of the spell. Freedom of movement all day for free, basically without spending any resources, is obviously great, and people will tend to suggest doing that, so that's not really what we're talking about today. Freedom of movement as a spell that you actually spend a spell slot on is a little less valuable. Being immune to paralyzed and restrained and difficult terrain not slowing you down is a pretty powerful tool, but a 4th level spell slot is a pretty big resource expenditure, so not every character is going to want to spend their 4th level spell slots on freedom of movement all the time. Nonetheless, I think that you should always have freedom of movement prepared somewhere in your party, because of the first line of freedom of movement. When you first cast it, it snaps an ally out of any stun effect. There's a lot of enemies in the game that cause you to become stunned, that have stuns, and often they're stuns that are quite hard to resist, because many of the most common ones, Mind Flayers, stun you with intelligence saving throws, which you may not have boosted, because they're otherwise very uncommon throughout Baldur's Gate 3. Having a tool that can get you out of a key stun if an ally is stunned in a bad position and about to take the full brunt of enemy attacks on their next turn, or if you just need that ally to cast a key spell or use a key ability or kill a specific enemy before their next turn rolls around, having that tool and that panic button is incredibly valuable. So in a lot of encounters, freedom of movement is extremely useful if an ally gets stunned. And although a level 4 spell slot to basically buy one turn of an ally's actions is not a great resource expenditure, remember that freedom of movement is good enough or almost good enough just to cast on its own already. So breaking an ally out of the stun and getting the really nice effects of the buff for whatever remains of that day is a very strong use of a level 4 spell slot. There's also an interaction that you may not know, which I will show you in just a second. Freedom of movement breaks you out of any stun, and that includes a lot of stuns that aren't called stuns, including what is probably the most common way for player characters to become stunned, the effect Lethargic. When your character becomes hasted, if the haste is broken or ends, they become lethargic, getting stunned for a turn. That can happen if you drop concentration on haste, either by accidentally casting another concentration spell, which, don't lie, it's happened to all of us, or an enemy breaks your concentration at an inopportune moment, and it can also happen if the haste spell naturally runs out, or the effect of the potion or Terrazul or spore grenades or whatever runs out, then your ally will become stunned. Having freedom of movement can snap you out of that, because it does indeed remove lethargic, allowing your ally to act freely during the rest of their turn. And so you can use your cleric or whoever has freedom of movement to buy back an error with haste, which is an extremely powerful but extremely dangerous tool. And this can give you a lot of leeway if you make a mistake or if an enemy breaks your concentration at a bad moment, which can easily be the beginning of the end of an honor mode run. This can get you out of it. Next up, Enhance Leap. I'm a firm believer that every party should have Enhance Leap available to them at all times. Some character in your active party should always have this spell, because it's just so powerful, both for traversing the world in general, and for its combat utility. Enhance Leap triples a creature's jumping distance. A character with 8 or 10 strength normally has a 15-foot jumping distance, so this takes them up to a 45-foot jump with the minimum amount of jump distance. A character with 20 strength normally has a 30-foot jump, so you get to jump as a weakling wizard with 8 strength. You can jump 1.5 times as far as the mightiest barbarian, just by casting Enhance Leap. What's more, this is a 10-turn duration ritual spell, which means that you can cast it without spending a spell slot as long as you're outside of combat. So you can cast this on your entire party before combat starts to effectively give everyone at will Misty Step, a bonus action to reposition yourself up to 45 feet of distance. is very close to being Misty Step, which is one of the best and most important positioning tools in the game. Obviously, there's some circumstances where Misty Step is still going to be superior, and Enhanced Leap doesn't totally replace it, but it does a very good resource-free impression of one of the most powerful tools out there. Casting this before combat starts on any character that needs height, any character that you don't want to be in contact with melee enemies, any character that is likely to want to move from low ground to high ground at any point in the combat, or just on all of your characters to give you more mobility options, are all extremely valuable tools, and they cost you nothing. Because this is a ritual spell, it takes no resources, meaning that it is absolutely free value, and if you're not casting it, you are leaving that value on the table. Now, I don't recommend doing this before every combat because, frankly, that's just extremely time-consuming. Only combats with a lot of verticality is it really worth spending the time to pre-cast Enhanced Leap before on all of your party members, but there are plenty of builds that are also built around long jump distance that can also benefit from this, like a Jumping Owlbear build, or a lot of monk builds, things like that, or Hammerhaft builds, whatever. But also, in any arena where there is a lot of verticality, this gives you effectively an at-will teleport, allowing you to move away from enemies with ease. Again, let's take a look at it. So I'm just going to go ahead and pre-cast Enhanced Leap on my entire party here, and you can see that we're not spending any spell slots, so we're just going to go ahead and do this. We'll have to watch the durations, but you actually get to cheese some duration out because of the way that out-of-combat turn durations are calculated. You can cast more than one spell per turn when you're not in turn-based mode, so you can see we've actually got our durations matching up a little bit more than they technically should. So let's go ahead and start a combat, and then we can use Enhanced Leap to retreat to where the enemies can't come after us. So I'm going to have Will start this combat here, just by firing some Eldritch Blasts.
Witnessed assaulting some.
Now, obviously, we could start the combat already on high ground, but we can use Enhanced Leap to do all kinds of additional movement while we are in any combat, so we're going to go ahead and take advantage of that. So we're going to jump up with this character. And our goal on this high ground, because it's relatively small, is we're going to try to position our characters such that they cover as much of the high ground as possible. So we're going to space them just far enough out that enemies can't fit in between them, and therefore block enemies from being able to jump up after us, because we are facing enemies that have high jumps as well, though some enemies won't. Going to have to do a little bit of careful movement with the mouse in order to make sure that we're able to get all of our characters up here. And there we go. So I'm just going to finish spreading my units out just a little bit so that they take up as much space as possible on the height. I guess we'll put Minsk here, and this way enemies are going to have a fairly awkward jump to get after us. Obviously, this only took our bonus actions, so we could continuously be shooting down at them, but we're just going to pass the turn and watch how this causes us to causes enemies to be unable to follow us. So the Steel Watcher just has to waste a dash going all the way around to try to get to us. This fist is again going to use a crappy low ground throw with disadvantage because they're attacking from the low ground, or with a penalty because they're attacking from the low ground. They did get a critical hit there. So these throws are going better than they usually would. But again, you can see how this prevents the enemies from being able to interact with our party because we have such easy mobility onto the high ground. And as they continue to come after us, because we still have this mobility, we can use it to just swap to a completely different area where, again, they won't be able to easily follow us. So this just gives us so much mobility and optionality in combat, and it costs us nothing to use. And finally, Banishment. Banishment is a level 4 spell that basically forces an enemy to make a saving throw, or you win the encounter against them. It removes them from the fight for 2 turns, and most fights with the most powerful enemy gone are going to be relatively easy to clean up. Also, they'll return in the same spot and not take a turn after they come back, so you will be able to place hazardous terrain under them, things like Walls of Fire, Spike Growth, or the aforementioned Plant Growth, Hunger of Hadar combo. You can set those up while the enemies are missing because of the Banishment. Now, Banishment, of course, has to be compared to other single-target control abilities, things like Command, which doesn't require concentration and is only a level 1 spell slot, or Hold Person, which does require concentration but lasts for up to 10 turns instead of 2 turns, and gives you automatic critical hits, also again is only a level 2 spell slot. So you might be wondering, why would you ever want to cast Banishment? The answer is that although Banishment has a weaker effect than a lot of other single-target control spells, there's a lot of fights in which it is wildly more reliable. Banishment targets the enemy's Charisma save. Most other control spells either target Constitution or Wisdom, which enemies will typically have very high save values in. Charisma saves, on the other hand, many enemies have very low saves. So I've wandered over here to the Umberlee Temple to show you exactly what I mean. Let's take a look at what it looks like if we try to command these cleric enemies using the command spell, which targets their wisdom save. 65% chance on Diomara Trellis here, 38% chance on Captain Goldwake. It's not an even 5% because he has a Bless spell on him. 60% chance against Seawind Star Stelidi. Let's take a look at what those chances look like if we're using Banishment instead. So that 65% chance becomes a 90% chance, 25 whole percent higher, because this enemy has Charisma saves 5 points lower than their Wisdom save. 73% instead of 38, and 85 instead of 60 rounds it out. So there's a lot of fights with enemies, and obviously we're showing a pretty dramatic difference here because this is mostly clerics, so they're going to have high wisdom saves regardless, but this holds true across a lot of enemies throughout the entire game that will have vastly worse charisma saves than other important saves, so Banishment can land much, much more reliably against those enemies than other spells. It's a weaker effect, but it's still a strong enough effect to win you the fight, and a strong enough effect consistently is often better than a slightly stronger effect, which may well be overkill, that may or may not actually work. So I've gone ahead and started a fight, so you can see exactly how you can use this spell to win a fight. So firstly, of course, we can just banish one enemy. It just reduces these enemy actions relative to our party's actions enormously for multiple turns. Against this fight where there's only 2 enemies in the fight, this halves the enemy action economy while only costing us a single action from our cleric. We can also upcast it to target multiple characters. This does become pretty expensive in terms of spell slots, but the effect is very much worth it. So let's see what happens if we just banish both of these guys. So now they're just gone for 2 turns, and that gives us plenty of time to set up dangerous effects for when they come back. Let's say we want them to land on a Spike Growth, so I'm just going to move my party out of the way here. And we can do things like set up the perfect ambush, put down a Spike Growth, put down a Cloud of Daggers, for example. Put our entire party into hiding if we want to, so our entire party can become hidden and then get sneak attacks or ambush attacks with advantage whenever enemies return, and then we just pass the turn until they come back and they arrive into a world of hurt. So I've passed 1 turn. I've decided we've done enough setup, though of course we could do plenty more if we wanted to set the ground on fire, throw down ice, or whatever. There's tons of things we could do to make their lives unpleasant when they come back. And then you can see they come back, they immediately take the damage, but they don't act. So this gives us a full turn of actions to attack the enemies, guaranteeing us a full turn where they're basically stunned, as well as the additional setup turns. So anytime you successfully land Banish on an enemy, it's good enough to win that fight. You don't have to use Hold Person in order to kill enemies specifically. Banishment is totally workable in order to win combats, and will land much, much more reliably against a large variety of enemies in the game. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at 5 of what I think are the most underrated spells in Baldur's Gate 3, and I hope this helps you use these powerful tools for your own honor mode runs, and give you creative ideas for solving encounters that might have been difficult for you. This was, of course, a bit of an experimental video. I haven't done something like this before, so let me know if this is the type of thing that you're interested in more of. Obviously, it helps me out a lot if people let me know if they want to see more of this, or if they don't want to see more of this kind of thing. Then that's definitely something that I want to know, because I can adjust what I'm doing accordingly. Of course, if you did enjoy the video, feel free to leave a comment of any kind and hit the like button. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm, so I really appreciate people who take the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 guides and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, friends. I'll catch you next time.